Everybody get a handout. All right. I don't think we're going to be very long tonight. We left off last month with Aaron, the older brother of Moses, being born. Keep in mind that Aaron was 3 years older than Moses. Aaron was born prior to the edict from the Pharaoh that all the Hebrew boys would be killed at birth. And that's going to lead us into Moses here. But that's where we left off last month, was the birth of Aaron in the year BC 1574. So with that being said, go to session 7 here. All right, and we also did talk last month about Jochebed and having an incestuous relationship with her cousin, which led to the births of Aaron, Miriam, and Moses. So that's where we're going to pick up tonight. So anyway, we'll pray and then I'll get started here. Thank you, Lord, for our time together. Help me now to present the information that has been given to me, and I pray, Lord, that we had learned something. Even in these narratives that we've heard so much about, help us, Lord, to maybe see something a different way. In Jesus' name, amen. Again, I'm not really necessarily preaching a sermon. We're just going through this world history from the Bible. And again, I'm not saying that these dates that have been given to us from the research from James Ussher from the book are inspired from the Lord, but he did put the work in and done the math and figured out all these dates. And again, I'm not saying that they're inspired, but they are something to give us to go by. From what I've seen, for the most part, from what I know, most of the dates have been accurate. I have had a question about a few, and I think we come across one of those last month. But anyway, this is really just going through the biblical narrative in a world history setting. And as we go through this, we're talking mainly about the Jews or the Hebrews in Egypt, but we are going to talk about different kingdoms, especially after this month, as the children of Israel are in the wilderness at that point. I think we're going to be talking more about different countries of the world. So anyway, I did do something a little different this go around. So if you go through there and you see some of the verses that are underlined, that's a marker for me that I want to read those. And so it's really nothing special for you all. It's just ones that I'm going to try to read as we go through the narrative here. So that's what those underlined verses are. And I stopped where I stopped because after the Hebrews leave Egypt, there was a break in the book, and besides that, I didn't want to start the next chapter, essentially, and so we're going to have enough to cover tonight. So it is going to probably be maybe a little shorter, but who really has any idea, right? All right. So beginning here, year from creation, 2443. So as a reminder that 2433, that is Ussher's take that 2,433 years after the creation of the world, these events took place. That's what the first number represents, year from creation. And then the BC is what is commonly known as what world history uses, the BC and the AD. And so it's BC 1571, which we're counting down to 0, actually 1, and then we start AD. But nevertheless, that's what those numbers represent. I haven't really explained those in the past couple months, and maybe you all are already familiar with that. But so anyway, 48 years after the death of her father Levi, Jochebed bore Moses to Amram. A year earlier, the Pharaoh of Egypt had given an edict to cast every Hebrew male newborn into the river. Now again, we're familiar with Moses being born and his mom making him a basket or a boat, a little ark, is what Scripture calls it, to hide him from the Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh's daughter finds him. We're all familiar with that story, but that is in the year of 1571 BC. And remember that he was raised as the Egyptian because Pharaoh's daughter found him and brought him in and raised him as an Egyptian And so Moses was schooled in all the Egyptian ways. Moses will live as an Egyptian for 40 years, go to the wilderness of Midian for 40 years, and come back to Egypt and to lead the Hebrews out of oppression in Egypt. Now, almost all of the entirety of Moses' life, from the time he was born until the time he was 80, until he was 40, is all represented in Exodus chapter 2. You know, all of the things that Moses did, and there's a lot of the Old Testament that's devoted to Moses, especially the first, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all devoted to Moses, but the first 40 years of his life are all summed up basically in the 25 verses of chapter 2. I just find that amazing, that you live 40 years and you have 25 verses to talk about that, and then, but we also understand that he's got, 4 books that are talking about him, so I guess it all evens out. But, Moses lives for 40 years as an Egyptian. We'll pick up with that here in just a little bit. 1556 BC, Cecrops, an Egyptian, took a colony of Sais, I think that's how you pronounce that, to Attica, and set up the kingdom of the Athenians. So we see here an Egyptian going to the area of Greece, modern-day Greece, and starting a colony that would be called Attica, and set up the Athenians, which Athens is still a major city in Greece today. But this apparently took place in 1556. And then the book noted that this was 780 years before the first Olympiad. The Olympics began in Greece. And just a little tidbit there. Next point, in 1539, the 18th year of Cecrops, the Chaldeans went to war against the Phoenicians. The Chaldeans were from the area of Babylon, or Iraq, and the Phoenicians were a group of people who lived along the Mediterranean coast of Lebanon and Syria. So here we see the first battle from Babylon, which we're talking about that in depth in Sunday school, but Babylon at that time, during the times we're talking about in Sunday school, was around the year 600 BC. Well, this here is in 1539, so you see how long Babylon was an entity. What is that? 1,000 years? 900 and some years. But we see here the Chaldeans or the Babylonians fighting against the Phoenicians in the area, and the Phoenicians were from the area of Lebanon and Syria. And anyway, let's move on to the next one. In this war, the Chaldeans were defeated, and the Arabians began to rule in Babylon for 216 years before Belus the Assyrian came to reign. So we see here that the battle that we read about in 1539, the Babylonians lost, and they were ruled by Arabians. The first king of the Arabians was Marosintus, who reigned for 45 years. History assumes this man is called Merodach. He was later reputed by the Babylonians to be a god. Succeeding kings copied their names from him. And we have read in Sunday school about a king named Evil Merodach, which evil is not necessarily the description of him. That was his. Don't take the term evil to mean a descriptive of this king. That was just Evil Merodach was his name. But he took his name from this Belus, which became a god to the Babylonians, named Bel. Not Baal that we read about, but Bel, B-E-L. Okay? But again, we see here that world history is not necessarily concentrated in just Canaan and not just Egypt. I mean, that's where the biblical narrative is taking place, so we all understand that. But there are countries, there are people, there are kingdoms outside of the realm of the biblical narrative, and that's what we're seeing here with this story about the Phoenicians, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, the Athenians. These were people that were active during the time that Israel was bondage in Egypt. And that's one thing we want to bring out in this study is there's more going on in the world than just what's happening with the Hebrews. And I think we all understand that, but I think our scope and our thoughts can just be narrowed down to, the Hebrews were the only people. But, again, in the world, and we read that about the flood, and after the Tower of Babel, how the Lord spread people throughout the entire world. So there's people living in what is now America during this time, but we don't necessarily read about that, at least not till this point. But understand that there are peoples that are alive and around and functioning outside of Egypt, Egypt and the Hebrews. Everybody okay so far? All right. But we do see here that Babylon especially was a country, was an entity or a kingdom for at least 900 and some odd years. Now they didn't rule the world, as we talked about in Sunday school, but they were a kingdom, and here we are in 1538, that they were a kingdom then. Year of creation, 2473 BC, 1531. Moses is now 40 years old. So he has lived as an Egyptian in the Pharaoh's house. He's been schooled as an Egyptian. But somewhere along the way, as he's 40 years old, he realizes that he is actually a Hebrew. He looks like them. He knows that he's a Hebrew. And we see here, he sees an Egyptian striking a Hebrew. Moses kills the Egyptian, and in the process is seen by others. Fearing for his life, Moses flees Egypt for Midian, which is a region in the Sinai Peninsula. And this is all spelled out in chapter 2, or Exodus chapter 2, which I referenced earlier. While in Midian, he marries Zipporah and becomes a shepherd for his father-in-law Jethro. And as I mentioned earlier, it's just amazing that Exodus 2, chapter 2 covers the first 40 years of Moses' life. But you can read about that in Exodus chapter 2. So now we have Moses being a shepherd, and he's going to serve as a shepherd for his father-in-law out in the Midianite desert for 40 more years, till he's 80 years old. And that's when he gets the call, which I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but he's getting the call from the Lord to go and set his people free, which again, I'm getting ahead there. But I want us to understand that Moses spent 40 years as an Egyptian in Egypt. He then spends 40 years of his life as a shepherd, a fugitive, if you will, in the Midianite desert, far away from where Egypt was. I wish I'd have, now that I'm here, I wish I'd have seen how far that was. I mean, hang on a minute. You ain't going anywhere. Let me just get a quick measurement on how far away from Egypt the Midianite Sinai Peninsula is. I don't think it's really that far. Let's just go measure the... let's just say 500 miles. That'll give you an idea. I mean, it's not like it was an oblong, all right? I mean, it was down the road a piece. You guys heard that song, Down the Road a Piece? Well, anyway, I'm not going to sing it to you. You can look it up later. Anyway. All right. Year from creation, 2474 BC, 1530. Oh, I want to reiterate the fact that, again, Moses was born during the time that the Pharaoh had given the edict that all the newborn Hebrews are to be thrown into the river and killed. And I want us to also understand that Aaron, being 3 years older, was alive and missed that. You know, he was fortunate that he was born outside of that edict, prior to the edict being given. And so Aaron didn't have to face the escape that his mother set up for Moses. Of course, you know, Moses really, being a newborn, he didn't know what was going on anyway. All right. Year from creation, 2474 BC, 1530. Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, was born. Now, Caleb is an interesting character because while we talk a lot about Joshua, we don't really talk a lot about Caleb, but Caleb and Joshua were the two faithful Hebrews that came back, and I'm jumping ahead again, but came back to Moses and gave a good report that they could take the land of Canaan. We know that Joshua got promoted to be the leader of the Hebrews when Moses died. We really don't read much about Caleb, but he was a very faithful and a very faithful man to Moses and to the Lord, and had faith that the Hebrews could in fact take Canaan. So we see here that he was born in 1530. In 40 years he will be one of the spies sent in to spy out Canaan by Moses at Kadesh Barnea. So understand that after the Passover, when the Hebrews were allowed to leave Egypt, they were on their way to Canaan land. Israel is what we call it today. Now, God had some plans for them in the Sinai desert, in the desert, in the wilderness. They weren't going to just leave and go directly to Canaan. God wanted to give them the law and the different. But it wasn't but just about a week's journey, perhaps let's just say a month because of the number of people that Moses had. But after an amount of time, and God dealing with them and giving them the law and telling them the instructions on how to build the temple, they get to Kadesh Barnea, which is a city on the southern border of Israel, and they are ready to take the promised land let's just say a month or two after they've left Egypt. And they're at this city, Kadesh Barnea. They're outside the camp. But Moses sends the 12 spies in. And again, I'm jumping ahead, but I want to make this point. Moses wants to get a report back on how the land is. And the 12 spies come back, and we know that Joshua and Caleb were two that gave a good report. Yes, we can do this. The Lord's on our side. The other 10 got the rest of the crowd murmuring. And that's where they were banished to wander in the wilderness until all of those adults died off. And we know it took roughly 40 years, Moses being the last of that original group of adults, to die off before Joshua took over and then allowed them to cross in Jordan, or across the Jordan River near Jericho. But they were ready to take Canaan just a few months after they left Egypt. And I don't think we really talk about that much, but understand that. But because of the murmurings of the people and the disbelief, God cursed them to wander in the wilderness and to let all the people, all the adults die off. Even Moses wasn't allowed to go in. But we see here Caleb, he was born and he was one of these that was faithful to the Lord. So continuing on here with the paragraph here, we may remember of the 12 spies sent by Moses, only Joshua and Caleb came back bringing an encouraging report. As such, Joshua and Caleb were the only two of the original group of adult Hebrews that left Egypt to enter the promised land. So let's turn, you don't have to turn there, I'm going to read it here, but Joshua chapter 14 talks about Caleb here. Joshua 14:6. Then the children of Judah came to Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said unto him, Thou knowest the thing that the Lord said unto Moses, the man of God, concerning me and thee in Kadesh Barnea. So Caleb is referencing back to that activity that happened 40 years ago. Now at this point, Caleb is 80 years old. 40 years old was I when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again, as it was in mine heart. Nevertheless, my brethren that went up with me made the heart of the people melt, but I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses sware on that day, saying, Surely the land whereupon thy feet have trodden shall thine inheritance and thy children's forever, because thou hast wholly followed the Lord my God. And now behold, the Lord hath kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years. So it took 5 years from the time the Hebrews crossed the Jordan River until the time that they had conquered the land and they were dividing the land up into their inheritance. So I said he was 80. He's actually 85 at this point. Even since the Lord spake this word unto Moses while the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness, and lo, now I am this day 85 years old. How far am I reading? To verse 10. Okay. So the time has come for Caleb to get his inheritance, and he goes to Joshua, and he says, hey, remember back 45 years ago? Hey, you and I, buddies, remember what we did? And Joshua gives him his inheritance that was promised to him by Moses 4 or 5 years prior. Now again, understand the faithfulness and the trustworthiness of the Lord and the faithfulness and of Caleb to believe and to hold on to that promise that he'd been given 45 years prior. Moses told him, you can have the land. And he held on to that promise for 45 years. Now the time has come. He goes to Joshua and says, hey, you remember what happened back there at Kadesh Barnea? Well, like Joshua could say, well, no, I don't remember, because Joshua remembers. And Caleb gets the inheritance that was given to him some 45 years earlier. And it's really no difference to us. The Lord has promised us an inheritance. But do we really believe it? I think, those of us that are truly saved understand that the Lord's promises are true and that we can hold on to these promises. So, Caleb here was born in 1530. Moving on to the next paragraph here. 2494, moving right along. We're jumping about 20 years here. Ramses Meamum died in the 67th year of his reign. Now, he would be the Pharaoh. Well, we're going to read that, Exodus chapter 2. The length of his tyrannical reign seems to be noted in the words of Exodus chapter 2, verse 23. And I will read that. Exodus 2:23. And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. And it's this Ramses Meamum that it's talking about here in verse 23. That the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by the reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by the reason of their bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. So this Ramses Meamum dies, a new Pharaoh takes over, and this is the Pharaoh that's going to be in power when the Hebrews are allowed to leave after the angel of death comes at the first Passover. This was the cruel bond. Even after Ramses was dead, the Hebrews endured for another 19 or 20 years under his son Amemphanes. Did I say that right? Amemphanes. So this is the Pharaoh that is in charge, and this will be another 20 years before this all happens. Now, jumping ahead, 25:13. So that's 13 plus 6, so that's 19 years have passed. Keep in mind, Moses is serving his father-in-law in the Midianite desert, some 500 miles away. He's out there, and we see here God now appears to Moses via the burning bush in the Midian desert. This is all in Exodus 3. The Hebrews have been serving the Pharaoh under heavy bondage now on this new Pharaoh for 19 or so years. Moses is now 80 years old. Moses obeys the command of God and takes his family from Midian to Egypt. So he's got a 500-mile trek, which I don't know how long that would take. A month? I don't know. In the years spent in Midian, Moses had neglected to circumcise his son Eleazar. Now, that was not necessarily the law, but that was something that the Hebrews did beginning with Abraham and Isaac. You were a Hebrew, you were born a Hebrew, you were circumcised. Well, Moses and the people living in Egypt were not circumcising their children. But we see here that Moses had neglected that command of the Lord. And so in Exodus chapter 4, we read of God stopping Moses from going further until his son is circumcised. So they're already on their way back to Egypt. Moses, his son, and his wife Zipporah. But God stops him there in Exodus chapter 4 because, hey, your son's not circumcised. This causes Zipporah to cut Eleazar in an angry response, and she returns with her son back to her father Jethro. So this stopping and this Moses wanting to circumcise his son gets Zipporah in an uproar. So she cuts Eleazar in a fit of anger, which is probably not the right time to be circumcising you want somebody that's half sane. Anyway, you women may not understand. But Zipporah takes her son and goes back to her father Jethro. Moses continues towards Egypt and meets with his brother Aaron. So it was at this time that Aaron was coming. He had been told by God that Moses was coming back, so Aaron goes and he meets Moses on the way. Moses and Aaron declare the message of God to Pharaoh, and they are angrily sent away. Throughout the months of BC 1491, God sent the different plagues against Egypt in order for Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go. So we know there was 10 plagues. And it was last Sunday we talked about the first plague, and now as I'm standing here in front of everybody, I can't remember what the first plague was. The water turned to blood. Anyway. According to Ussher, now Ussher is the man that wrote the book that we're going through. The 5th through the 10th plagues began on the first day of the month in the month Abib, which eventually becomes the first month in the Hebrew calendar. So according to Ussher, the last 5 plagues all happened within just a couple of weeks of each other. Now again, I have no reason to dispute this. He's put his reputation on the line by writing this book and putting this in there, so I'm not going to dig further to see if he's actually... I hope everybody understands that. This is what he says. I'm just going to take it for what it's worth. So the 5th through the 10th plagues are all within this 2-week period in the month of Abib, which eventually becomes the first month of the Hebrew calendar, which is roughly March and April. Now we understand that our Easter coincides with their Passover, and we understand that the Easter always takes place in either March or April. And so understand that the first Passover that we're going to read about happens a couple of weeks after the beginning of the month, which is what happens today on the Hebrew calendar. Anyway, the month of Abib, which eventually becomes the first month of the Hebrew calendar. So the last 5 plagues happen within about 14 days. Now, I should have mentioned this sooner, but here it is. Abib is also known as the name Nisan, Nisan. And it was made as the first month in commemoration of the Passover, which was soon going to take place. On the 10th day of the month, the feast of the Passover was instituted. Now, they didn't kill the Passover and they didn't eat the Passover on the 10th day. That's when the motions were put in place to have the Passover 4 days later. Okay? The command was to select your lamb and to get things prepared, because on the 4th day would be when they would actually have the actual Passover, when the angel of death would come. So they had 4 days to prepare. On the 10th day of this month, the feast of the Passover was instituted. The lamb was chosen and killed 4 days later. The lamb was chosen, sorry about that, and then killed 4 days later. Does everybody understand the grammar there? I should have put a comma. The lamb was chosen on the 10th day. It was killed on the 14th day. Everybody okay with that? Getting in the weeds there, but anyway. Meanwhile, Moses brought upon the Egyptians the 9th plague, which was 3 days of darkness. Now, I say Moses here. We all understand it was God. But Moses is dealing directly with Pharaoh here. Let my people go. Pharaoh says no. A couple times he said yes, and said, just kidding. Moses brought upon the Egyptians the 9th plague, which was 3 days of darkness. So they choose the lamb for the Passover, and for 3 days it's totally dark, only for the Egyptians. The Egyptians left it was so dark during that time that none of the Egyptians left the place where they were while the darkness lasted. The Israelites, however, had light in their dwelling throughout this time. So the Israelites choose their lamb on the 10th. It goes dark. The light comes back on the 14th day, which we're going to read here. The Israelites, however, had light in their dwelling. On the 14th day, Moses spoke with Pharaoh for the last time. The 14th day. This is your last warning, Pharaoh. And he says there, Moses told him of the 10th plague which was to come upon him, which was the death of the firstborn of every family that didn't keep this Passover, which essentially was most all of the Egyptians, okay? Moses told the Pharaoh the 10th plague which was come upon him. This was the death of all firstborn of Egypt, which came to pass the following night at midnight. And we understand that. The death angel came and killed the firstborn of every creature that did not observe this Passover of taking the blood and painting it on the doorposts. That was the sign. It was not necessarily the amount of faith in the households. It was you're obeying God by painting your doorposts with the blood of the Lamb. That was the command. Anyone who was in that house that had the doorpost painted with the blood was spared, which was almost all of the Hebrews. And some of the Egyptians did this. I'm not going to get into all those details. But most all of the Egyptians did not do this. And so every household had a death this night because this death angel came. This was the death of the firstborn of Egypt, which came to pass the following at midnight. In a rage, Pharaoh ordered Moses to get out of his sight and never come back again. That evening, the Hebrews celebrated the Passover, and this is spelled out in Exodus 5 through 12. So you can read about that later, and that's where we're going to stop. But at this point from the Passover, Pharaoh told them all to leave, and as they left, they took all their stuff, plus the Egyptians were in such a hurry and such a haste for them to leave that they gave them stuff to leave, and we're going to read about that later. But just understand that everything that the Hebrews had and was carrying with them when they left, they were given to by the Egyptians as a token to get out. Now we understand when they get to the Red Sea, Pharaoh changes his mind and chases after him. That'll be next month. We'll talk about that. Any comments or questions about what we talked about tonight? All right. So we'll pick up next month. We are now free of the bondage of the Egyptians. Now we're going to be wandering around for 40 years. So anyway. All right. Well, with that, we'll close. If you